this is a dream come true. I'm down at the National Museum of Transportation in Kirkwood, Missouri, suburb of St. Louis. And yes, I am sitting in a 1963 Chrysler Turbine Car, and this is where the fun begins. Sounds like a jet? Because it is a jet. With that, guys, we have a lot to talk about, but first, let's hear this thing run. Jeff Pro from Two Hacks Garage. Well, I tell you what, guys, I'm here at the National Museum of Transportation in Kirkwood, Missouri. It's a suburb of St. Louis, and I am going to be doing a video on the coolest car that's ever been designed. Yep, I'm sitting in a 1963 Chrysler Turbine Car. You can probably hear it run in the background. Before I go in depth with this video, I'm going to do a walk around and having this thing run, because you know what? This is really, really cool. This is an opportunity of a lifetime. Mike down here, he's going over the car with me, and we're going to get a lot more in-depth video on this. But I tell you what, guys, this thing is absolutely awesome. You know what? Bring me the camera real quick, Jeffrey. So this thing's running right now, and if you want to take a look, have a whole bunch of really cool gauges. So right there is the pyrometer, and what that thing does is that measures your inlet air temp. And right now, if you look, it's sitting at about 1300 degrees. You have amperage and you got your oil. Other than that, you know, it's pretty basic. You have a speedometer, fuel, you have your RPMs, and if you read that right, yep, that is correct. That's idling at roughly 22,000 RPMs. We're going to go over this here in a little bit. What I want to do is get out there and show you how this thing sounds when it's running. This is one of the 1963 Chrysler Turbine Cars that were built. This is one of 55, and as you can hear, it does sound like a jet turbine. We have a whole lot to cover, but I wanted to make sure you guys heard what this thing sounds like. Yep, that is idling at 22,000 RPMs. Let's go see what it sounds like from the back of the car. So this is what the car sounds like idling from the rear end. It's not the, you know, choppy cam you'd have heard in a 1963 Plymouth Max Wedge. This thing truly does sound like a jet. It's one of the most iconic sounds you'll ever hear in automotive history. And I had the opportunity today to make a film on this truly amazing vehicle. With that, guys, what I want to do is I want to go over the car with you, just kind of high level, and really show you what makes this car probably the coolest car ever built on the planet. But before I do that, I do want to show you what this exhaust actually looks like underneath this car, and you can hear it as it's running and see how it functions. This thing sounds like a jet. It's actually really awesome. It sounds absolutely wonderful. Well, sorry for the noise, guys, but this has these very large stainless steel ducts. It is kind of like a dual exhaust, because it is, and they're these large, flat, stainless steel ducts that point down. What that's doing is the ducting in there, what it's designed to do is remove heat, push it back out here. Now, mind you, it is warm. It's a little bit warmer than a regular vehicle, but you know what, guys? It's really not that bad. It sounds absolutely amazing. I dig it. Check that out. Before we get started on this vehicle, as the car runs, I want to show you something absolutely cool. This has 3 gauge pods. They're very futuristic, space age, almost kind of a mid-century minimalist design. Absolutely gorgeous. But what I wanted to show you here is if you look at this gauge here, you got your amps, you got your oil, and you got your turbine inlet temperature. That's called a pyrometer. So as this thing sits here and idles, if you look at that gauge, it goes from 0 to about 2,000 degrees. Idling, that's at about 1,200 degrees. And then, well, it's pretty basic, guys. You got a fuel gauge, you got your speedometer, and then over here, well, it's pretty neat. You got yourself a clock, and you have your tach. That goes from 0 to 60,000 RPMs. So that idle, that is correct. This thing's idling at about 22,000 RPMs. Pretty cool. I absolutely love this car. With that, guys, we have a lot to talk about. All right, so what we're going to do now that you've heard the car, you're going to see what it sounds like when it shuts down. Sounds like a jet. All right, guys, well, that was actually pretty awesome, getting to hear this thing run, getting to hear it start up, how it turns off, and all that fun jazz. We got a lot to talk about. I'm kind of going to do a high level of this. Kind of what brought this on, I just got done reading a book by Jay Leno on the Chrysler Turbine Cars. I've actually been a really big fan of this car for a long time. A friend of mine named John, he's a really cool guy, and a friend of mine named Doug, you know what, they just went and saw one recently, and I said, you know what, I really need to do a video on this car, and the closest one to me, well, it's here in Kirkwood, Missouri, which is a suburb of St. Louis, and it's at the National Museum of Transportation. With that, guys, the year is 1963. First off, this is a 1963, but what did America look like in 1963? Well, the average salary was $4,400 a year, which was about $84 a week. A gallon of gas was 30 cents. A loaf of bread was 22 cents. Eggs, well, they're about 57 cents a dozen, and a gallon of milk is roughly $1. A cup of coffee, well, it's only 35 cents, and a bottle of Coke only sets you back 10 cents. Cheeseburger, 19 cents, and the average price of a new car is $3,200. And the average price of a house, well, that was roughly $19,000. Pop culture, 3 TV channels at the time, CBS, ABC, and NBC. Beverly Hillbillies was the #1 TV show, and the #1 song out in America was Surfin' USA by the Beach Boys. The Beatles also released their first album, which was Please, Please Me. Cleopatra, well, that was the #1 movie in theaters, and Dr. No, the first James Bond movie, was released in the United States. Something really cool about that year, it didn't get to be popular until later on in the hippie years. The lava lamp was actually created by Edward Craven Walker. Sports, well, tell you what, guys, that was also a pretty fun year. Dodgers swept the Yankees to win the World Series. Chicago Bears beat the New York Giants to become the NFL champions, and the Boston Celtics, they beat the LA Lakers 4-2 games to become the NBA champs. Racing world, that got pretty exciting too. Parnelli Jones won the Indy 500. Don Garlits wins his very first national event win in NHRA. It was Top Fuel, and it was at the Winter Nationals. Joe Weatherly wins the NASCAR championship in his Pontiac, barely edging out Richard Petty. In the world of technology, the first push-button telephone was released to the public by AT&T. Computer mouse was invented by Doug Engelhart. The cassette tape was also invented by Lou Ottens and released by Philips. Zip codes actually were introduced in the United States. Well, in the automotive world, also pretty exciting for 1963. The PCV valve was introduced to help lower emissions. The best-selling car was the newly designed Buick Riviera. The Motor Trend car of the year was the American Motors Rambler, and the fastest production vehicles were the Shelby Cobra 260 and the Studebaker Avani. Politics, lots of turmoil in 1963. JFK, who pretty much ushered us into the space race, he was assassinated. Martin Luther King Jr. gave his famous I Have a Dream speech at the Lincoln Memorial. Travel, trade, and financial transactions to Cuba were made illegal, including one of my favorites, a Cuban cigar. The US, the UK, the USSR, they all signed a nuclear test ban treaty, and the Vietnam War ramps up after LBJ assumes office. Space age, right? Well, what happened with space that year? NASA had their very first Mars 1 spacecraft make the first flyby of Mars. The last Mercury program manned flight took place, and that was astronaut Gordon Cooper on Mercury 9. The first geostationary orbit satellite was launched by NASA. It was called SYNCOM-2, and it was used for telecommunications. The first woman was also put into space, and that was Valentina Tereshkova of the USSR. Wow, that is absolutely a lot of history, a lot of very important things that took place in 1963. And as you can see, in 1963, culture was changing, society was changing, the whole entire globe was changing. And guess what, guys? We were getting very high tech. Music was getting to be awesome. And you know what? So was style. Speaking of style, what we're going to need to do is we're going to now go on and talk about the 1963 Chrysler Turbine Car. All right, guys, let's talk about a little bit of the brief history of this car. It was an experimental two-door hardtop powered by a gas turbine engine. This particular model was produced in 1963 and 1964. However, Chrysler had many turbine car programs that started in the early 50s and lasted through the late 70s. That will be for another video. Let's talk about this one right here. Space age, minimalistic, and somewhat of a mid-century design. The Chrysler Turbine Car truly embodied the culture and personality of the early 1960s. A total of 55 cars were built, 50 for a public relations program, and 5 were prototypes. All were painted turbine bronze metallic except for one, which was painted white, and it was a prototype that never saw the street. The car was styled by Elwood Engel of Chrysler Design Studio. He came from Ford, and he had a big part in the T-Bird. And as you can see, this car does have a little bit of that Ford Thunderbird styling to it, so that's why it kind of looks that way. It's actually pretty neat. The little history behind the Elwood Engel and the Chrysler Design Studios is pretty awesome. If you get time, go check that out. Italian design studio Carrozzeria Ghia constructed the bodies in Turin, Italy, and then they were shipped to Detroit for final assembly. Chrysler started to develop the turbine engines in the late 1930s for military and civilian use. This effort was led by engineer George Huebner Jr., and actually, George worked with Wernher von Braun on a rocket program as part of a contract with the Army. If that sounds familiar, well, the Saturn V rocket program that took us to the moon in 1969 with the Apollo program in NASA, well, guess what, guys? That was actually Wernher von Braun's little baby, little brainchild, you know, what he really specialized in, rockets. Kind of makes sense looking here, right? Space age, rocket powered, if you want to call it, jet age. That's where that comes into play. Another brilliant engineer that was part of this program was a soft-spoken yet extremely smart guy named Sam B. Williams. He was credited of overcoming a lot of the many challenges that came with the turbine car, and actually the guy that helped make that actual engine fit within the engine bay and all that. It took about a week to build, and all the engines and cars were tested at Chrysler's research laboratories. Chrysler was developing the car as an alternative to the piston-driven engines of the time. Turbine engines had way fewer parts to them. They run on many fuels, and due to the efficiency of them, the power plant lasted quite a long time. The turbine car was actually created initially to test a consumer reaction to the broad range of climates that these vehicles would be ultimately given out to consumers to test drive them over 3-month periods of time. What I just touched on there, guys, was the consumer program that Chrysler ran, operated for the turbine car research program. Basically, each person got a car for 3 months, free of charge. This program ran from October 29th, 1963 to October 28th, 1965. The last car to go through the program was actually not completed until January 28, 1966. Candidates were selected by the accounting firm Tuch, Ross, Bailey, and Smart. In order to be able to get one of these cars, well, it's actually quite simple. You need to own a car or have a household that owned a car and be able to show a valid license. The first people to get one of these awesome 1963 turbine cars was Mr. and Mrs. Richard E. Vihaya of Broadview, Illinois, which was a suburb of Chicago. The cars were actually on display in shopping centers, automotive shows, and even the New York's World's Fair. Chrysler really liked to show these things off. In all, the turbine car was displayed in 23 cities, 21 countries, and a total of 5 continents. Chrysler made a decision not to mass produce the car for many reasons. Poor fuel economy, noise, cost, lack of long-term support for these vehicles, what I'm going to call as a sluggish throttle response, basically the about 1.5 second lag from when you press the pedal to when it's actually started to go. That slag right there, well, most guys that are kind of the old hot rod type people, they know when you mash that pedal, it goes. This car, however, like turbine engines, there is just that little bit of lag. But that being said, for 1963, the performance wasn't actually all that bad. 0 to 60 was in about 12 seconds, and you could actually drive this car up to about 120 miles an hour. But the only problem with that is, you know what, it was very expensive to maintain due to the exotic metals that were used in this engine. The cars were actually ordered to be destroyed by Chrysler. They were considered a liability, and in many cases, they didn't want to pay the tariff and taxes on this vehicle. They were considered a liability not only for that, but also considering that they did not have that long-term support. The government did not make them do this, contrary to a lot of the belief. Like almost all concept cars from the time and prototypes, they were unfortunately slated to be destroyed after they were done with their program. Once Chrysler went through the consumer program, analyzed all the data and feedback, you know what, guys? These things, unfortunately, well, they were destroyed. There are a few films on YouTube that actually show that. I can't really bear to watch it because it's kind of sad seeing these modern technology, very futuristic things of the time that were unbelievably beautiful get destroyed like that. In 1966, after all the cars had to be returned to Chrysler, they were in a local scrapyard, they got crushed, they got destroyed, and ultimately even some of them got burned. The program actually logged over 1.1 million miles. That's a lot to be said, considering there was only 50 of these cars that were actually in that program. Well, in 1966, once all the cars were back, Chrysler ended up destroying all but 9. Funny part about that is, all 50 were actually offered to museums, and only 6 responded. So ultimately what happened was, 6 vehicles went to museums, and Chrysler's kept 3. Out of those 3, well, one of them ended up being in Jay Leno's collection. This car here happens to be at the National Museum of Transportation in Kirkwood, Missouri, which is actually a suburb of St. Louis. There is no concrete estimate on what the actual cost was to build one. However, estimates have them anywhere up to $300,000, but today I learned it was probably closer to $50,000. What are they worth today? Well, that is also unknown. The details of these sales have also remained extremely private. You know what? I can actually see why, because this thing here is worth its weight in gold. All right, now we're going to get into the facts and figures of this car, aka dimensions, drivetrain, interior, all that absolutely awesome stuff that you really want to see instead of hearing me ramble. This car had a 110-inch wheelbase. Overall length was 201.6 inches, which is roughly 16.8 feet. The width of this vehicle is 72.9 inches, which is just over 6 feet wide. The height of the vehicle, well, it's 53.5 inches, or about 4.5 feet tall. Curb weight of this car, 3,952 pounds. The drivetrain in this thing had an A831 gas turbine engine. It produced 130 horsepower, 36,000 RPMs, produced 425 foot-pounds of torque at stall speed. The engine only weighed 410 pounds, which is far fewer than the piston-driven engines of the time. It idled at 22,000 RPMs, as we showed you in that video, and I tell you what, it just sounds absolutely beautiful idling at that. Max RPM was 60,000 RPM, and that roughly equated to about 120 miles an hour. Exhaust temps, 180 degrees at idle, 525 degrees at what's considered full load, aka mashing the go fast pedal, and made engine temps of up to 1,760 degrees. Engine compressor that had a 4-to-1 ratio and was considered 80% efficient. The engine combustor efficiency of this was 95%. Fuel economy for the time, upwards of overall 14.5 miles to the gallon. In some cases, you could get 18 to 19 on the highway. The thing had a 21 gallon tank. That's a mouthful there, and sorry. It ran on extremely various large amounts of fuels that pretty much anything you combust, throw at it, it's going to ignite, like diesel, gasoline, jet fuel, kerosene, tequila, and even fancy French perfume. All right, so here's underneath the engine bay. As you can see, it has this absolutely massive air inlet box on that. And one thing I just learned recently that I did not know this thing between the actual engine, power steering, and the transmission, it actually runs on 6 quarts of transmission fluid. Back then it was used in Dexron. Today it's like the Dexron 3. And so the whole system with the engine, power steering, and the transmission, you know what, guys? That's all one fluid. It's Dexron, and it's super simple to change. And you actually drain it through in the back of the transmission. And there is a stainless steel filter that's washable, and it was a Fram 1414. Pretty neat how this thing works. So basically, you do have your air intake, you have an air compressor, you have your igniter and your burners, your regenerators that turn and spin that create all that heat. And then that's what's going to go back through the power turbine and the compressor to power the rear wheels. In this video, at the end of it, I'm going to put the different diagrams and all this, but this is absolutely a work of art. Really awesome. I don't really know enough about this to really explain it highly in detail. I've been reading more on it, but I tell you what, guys, at the end of this video, you'll see all kinds of really cool diagrams of it. All right, so that's the rear of the duct right there. As you can see how they're kind of pointed down. And at the beginning of this video, I had it running, and you could hear how that ran. But yeah, that's how you actually dissipated the heat. And these things are just absolutely massive. If you start crawling back up here a little bit more, you can see the ducts that are quite a bit long. And you can kind of get a better view of that. Absolutely awesome. They kind of just snake around over the axle and they run their way back. Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely awesome. All right, so I'm kind of crawling underneath this vehicle here. And I'm sorry, earlier I said stainless steel. The exhaust was actually aluminum. And if you take a look, you see those ducts that run all the way back. And, you know, that duct work is designed from all that hot engine up to 1700 degrees that comes out of the gas turbine engine. Well, having it spread out in this design helped dissipate that heat. And as you know, aluminum, well, that is a really good ability to get rid of heat. So yeah, that's the exhaust there. The transmission, it's kind of neat. If you notice back up in here, it does not have a torque converter because there's the pan. And you go back, it's kind of hard to see. There's the tail shaft, and you know, goes all the way back like that. We're going to get some more video here in a second of that. But the kind of neat part about this is these do not have a bell housing or a torque converter. Reason being is a gas turbine actually acts as its own torque converter. Let's see if we can get some more shots of what this looks like underneath here. So kind of a little bit of technical data behind this car. That is a Chrysler 8.75 rear end. These did have, I want to say, 323 gears in them. And, you know, sorry if the audio is kind of choppy. I'm actually crawling underneath this car because this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. The transmission that was used in this was actually a Chrysler TorqueFlite 3-speed. Like I said, no bell housing or torque converter, as the turbine acted as the converter itself. Kind of unique. Not unique, but kind of typical for a Mopar. If you look, it's got leaf springs and rear shocks. That was, you know, pretty much the mainstay of the Chryslers back in the day and carried on for a very long time. So while that suspension in the rear is what Chrysler always used, I want to show you what they used in the front. All right, well, while we're on suspension, the front of these Mopars back in the day, in the 60s, carried on through the 70s and all that, most of them were considering what you would call a torsion bar with shock setup. However, if you look at this car, it does not have that. It's actually an A-arm style with a coilover and shock. Reason behind that is this frame in the front is a little bit wider to get that turbine to fit underneath there, so that was the design they went with. These cars, if you look, they do have a four-wheel drum brake on there, it's considered air over hydraulic. So basically there's an air pump underneath the hood of this that has compressed air to power the hydraulic system. That's actually pretty neat in itself. Considering this car doesn't have a power brake system like a typical vehicle from manifold vacuum, they had to do that in order to be able to make these brakes work correctly. All right, well, let's get on to the tires and stuff on this. They used a 14-inch wheel with a 750/14 white wall tire and a very space-age turbine-style wheel covers. Let's take a look at those. These happen to be the Goodyear version of that. Very, very, very nice. And if you look at that turbine wheel cover, that should look familiar because if you go back of the car, it's got that same turbine styling cues in the back. Let's get a better look at this paint. If you look here, that paint's actually got a nice metallic hue to it. It's absolutely beautiful. This was called Turbine Bronze Metallic, and all those cars, like I said, were painted this color except for one that was a white prototype. These did have a black vinyl top. Very, very beautiful. All of them are that way. Let's take a look at what we got going on in the interior on this thing. Minimalistic, mid-century, and very space age with bronze leather interior. If you take a look at this, it's got a lot of aluminum and stainless steel in here, and extremely, extremely, extremely awesome design. Really does embody the spirit of the early 1960s. It is a 2+2 design, which means you have buckets in the front and rear, 2 passengers front and 2 passengers rear. All right, well, I did show you the gauges earlier on there and kind of go over that a little bit. So they are 3 large futuristic gauge pods: speedometer, oil, amperage, pyrometer, which measures temperature, tachometer, fuel, mileage, and clock. Like I said earlier, the tach had a 60,000 RPM limit on that, and the speedometer had a 120 mile an hour max limit on it. The pyrometer reads turbine inlet temps 0 to 2,000 degrees. Check out the dash on this car. It's actually pretty simple, guys. You have ignition, you have a cigarette lighter, volume, your selectors, and like I said, this is an AM radio. And it's kind of neat. You have lights for like brake pressure, turbine power by Chrysler. One unique thing I think on this car that I really liked is the turbine-inspired center cap on the steering wheel, which is absolutely beautiful in itself. And if you look over here on the doors, these cars actually had power windows. There was individual controls on there, but however, this here, it had a master control here. So you could control the power windows on that. One thing I do want to show you on this car is a little bit more as far as what I think makes this car extremely special. So it has a very unique turbine-inspired center console. And if you look here, you have your shifter, you have defrost, temp controls, wipers, and even a parking brake. Ashtrays, even in the rear, were very functional for these vehicles. You look in the back. Yeah, that is absolutely gorgeous. Very, very stylish car. Just take a moment and kind of just soak it all in. Like I said, this car, in my opinion, absolutely does embody what the 1960s and the early 60s were all about. How everything was changing, how everything was really coming of age, technology, culture, you name it, space race. Well, this car, in my opinion, yeah, it's got it all. So here's something pretty neat. So these are actually rear mounted battery trunks. I know there's a lot of diagrams that show that actually in the front, but that was kind of like an earlier design. These were actually in the rear. These are modern batteries, but here is something still with the car. If you look at that, it's actually what these are. Back in the day with the sealed lead acid batteries, they actually had vent caps. So all those little red caps like you see on the Mopar batteries, some of them have yellow and all that, but those were the vent caps. Normally those just vent in the engine bay, but to keep them out of the trunk, you had all these tubes. And what it did was it vented it outside the vehicle. Pretty wild setup. Trunks on this aren't really that big, but you know what? You really didn't need to have it that big. And back here is the actual starter in the back. That's where the batteries will go. What I do like about this is the actual design of this. I mean, that is just absolutely beautiful. But yeah, that's one also kind of neat little feature of the turbine car. Rear mounted batteries, and it's actually got battery vent tubes. Like I said, these are modern batteries, so they're not on there, but the old batteries had these vent tubes, and this car still actually has them. Well, there you have it, guys. That's just a brief, very brief overview of this car. I hope you really enjoyed this video. I enjoyed making it. I do want to give out some thanks, though. I want to thank my dad, my son, and my friend John. So if you guys know, I'm J2, my son's J3, and my dad's J1, Jeff, and Jeff. Kind of a little inside joke. My friend John, he does give me a whole lot of help on filming this stuff. He came down, and we had a whole lot of fun doing this. But you know what, guys? If you really want to get a lot of information on this car, all you need to do is pick up a really awesome book. I read it myself. That's what kind of really got me hooked on this. It's Chrysler's Turbine Car by Jay Leno, and it has chock full of information. Another really cool thing is, if you're ever in the area in Kirkwood, Missouri, which is a suburb of St. Louis, the National Museum of Transportation, this car is sitting here. It's always on display, and it was absolutely worth the trip to come see this car. You know, with that being said, though, guys, my dream of actually owning one of these cars is just that. It's just a dream. However, I do have quite a few vintage collectibles of this, and one of them I really do like. Back in the day, a lot of dealerships had promo models, and I just happened to have one made by Johan of this car. I also have one of the original Johan model kits and many other things with that. So what's next? Well, you know what's next, guys? I'm going to be doing some videos on the other turbine car programs and kind of piece things together on how this car happened from the 1960s going back to the 1950s, along with going through the 1970s. And yes, there is a NASA connection to that. But I do want to thank Mike and Kobe here at the National Museum of Transportation for allowing me to make this video. It's been a huge, huge dream come true, because this is probably the coolest car ever made in existence, and I actually got to start one up, sit in it, and make a video with it. With that, I hope you enjoyed it. More to come from Two Hacks Garage, whether it's building engines, racing cars, or from the archives and having more history. Thank you.